Cool. Well, that is 2 o'clock. So I guess we should get started and make our introductions. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel on talking about the hard things. We're going to talk about creating stories out of reflection, the reasons and for that, and challenges involved, and what rewards are involved, of course. And just going to introduce our panelists and let them talk a little bit about their own games and their particular approaches to the difficult things that they've just discussed within them. So Thierry, you're the founder and president, I believe, of Sarepta Studio. Is that right? Can you tell us a little bit about your game, The Messenger?
Yes, well, so it's a retro-inspired platformer, and the core ingredient in Messenger is the player's expectations. And so it starts off looking very, I don't want to say necessarily basic, but certainly classic. So it's like you're this ninja in a village that catches on fire, and you're basically given a scroll. Hey, no time to explain. Carry the scroll across your cursed world, and you got to take it to the top of the mountain. And so it's as cliched as it gets, and that's by design. And the idea is to kind of set your expectations here, and then to take it so that you don't expect how far the game will end up going, and you end up time traveling and having shifts between 8-bit and 16-bit, like future console generations, to reflect the past and future worlds and things like that. And the most deceptive thing is it's in the end it's really about personal growth and tackling and handling depression and anxiety and learning to stand up for yourself and develop healthy boundaries. But it's all in a way that all of that is kind of optional in the game. If you don't look for it, you won't find it. But if you start talking, you find that about 90% of the dialogue is just waiting there in case you care to take a look. The idea there was to make a game that was both entertaining but also inspiring, to set people on their own personal growth journey if they care to take the first step, in a very easy mode of like through playing a game. So yeah, that's the gist of it: ninjas and personal growth.
That's a good tagline, yeah. Catharina, your studio, Sarepta Studio, worked on Lebensborn, which dealt with a lot of difficult issues in a much more kind of head-on and overt way. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, Child Lebensborn, it's a parent simulation game right now for mobile, where it's basically going to set up like somewhat of a Tamagotchi in a way. You have a child that you've adopted, and your job is to take care of this child and be a good parent. But the purpose of this game is to tell the stories of Lebensborn children who grew up in Norway after the Second World War. So these were kids that were born of Norwegian women and German soldiers. And there's a lot of, it didn't go well, kind of. So basically our goal is to put you in the role of someone that's there to take care of this child, and you just try to get through a difficult time together.
Okay. So, and that's I think there's a lot of things that happen as well outside of that main theme, aren't there? It's not a light-hearted feed your child and buy them Lego occasionally and everything will be okay kind of parental simulation, is it?
No, it's I mean, there are definitely a lot of nice and light moments as well, of just being happy and having a good like family together. But there will definitely be quite a lot of frustration and fear and sadness and anger as well. And that's kind of the goal, to take you through a roller coaster and try to make you see kind of, I guess, a certain hopelessness that people maybe went through, but also, I guess, how important it is to be there for someone that is going through a hard time.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, I mean, it's a really interesting social issue, and it makes it clear that the resonance of wars and the shadows that they cast last a hell of a lot longer than the end of the fighting, and with these horrendous kind of after effects that can work their way through communities for a very long time after the shooting stops. So it's a really interesting issue to approach. What was it that sort of led you to focus on that?
Well, it was actually a production company called Teknopilot, and the lead there, Aren, she was assisting documentary crew in creating a documentary about the Lebensborn, where they were interviewing them and talking to them about it. But she realized that this would be yet another movie of old people talking about the war, and how would we be able to actually, how would that be able to reach the people it needed to reach to create some kind of change and to actually matter. Um, so she met me at a transmedia conference, and she was very clear. She was very insistent in trying to find out if there was a way to create a game around this, to, of course, both share the stories, because this is something we haven't really heard about in Norway. For some reason, we were really shocked when we learned about this, but also to make people emphasize and care about this topic. So it really came from her, and initially it was just a job we did to create a concept. But as soon as we made the concept, our studio really realized that this was something important, and we really wanted to continue and do the production of it.
Yeah. Thierry, I think the Messenger is a bit more of a personal story, isn't it? There's a lot of retrospection and a lot of catharsis, I think, for you in the things you were writing about in the game.
Yeah, for sure. For me, it's more about the. It's funny how we were talking before the panel, how we kind of we're each grabbing this from both ends, of what creates issues for people. Yeah, for me, it's very much about the personal growth and certainly the inner child that we all have within our chest, that if it was hurt, it'll keep kicking and screaming inside of you until you stop and pay attention and listen to it and be like, what do you need, and what can I do for you to kind of heal you so that we can live in harmony, and then you can sort of develop this inner peace, and then hopefully be someone functional if you're going to be a teacher or a boss or a parent or whatever, so that these cycles stop repeating. But yeah, for me it's all, the whole thing is I wanted to basically show the whole world all the things I wanted to hide, so it was very much this embracing of vulnerability, and in a way to sort of journal and also try to heal, while also trying to tell a story that signals to people that it's okay not to feel okay all the time, and how you can basically face these things, and how getting better can basically then trickles down to the rest of your life, and then also how you can be a more helpful or positive person around you, and how that can hopefully affect some change.
I think, from what I know about the Messenger, the mechanics are, as you sort of said, a retro-based side scroller, but it's a difficult game, right? It's not a simple game to complete. Did those mechanics and the fact that it is quite challenging, is that part of the message there? Are those kind of things intertwined, or is that just incidental?
Mm-hmm. Well, no, the struggle is there as a sort of as a metaphor, I guess. But also the important thing there is that you also do have the power, So it's kind of like by making the stakes really higher, by exaggerating the situation, you understand the image, and then the fact that these are things that you can take on, that you can face head on, that you can essentially kill your dragon and find your treasure, is the idea there.
Yeah. And Catharina, I think there's some interesting stuff to talk about in terms of the mechanics of dealing with difficult issues, and essentially kind of gamifying sometimes tragedy, or gamifying things which need to be taken seriously. And obviously that's something you must have had to approach quite delicately with Lebensborn as well. I'd imagine, this is a really sensitive issue. You deal with some big things in there, but you are essentially trying to wrap it up in an entertainment product. I think I'd like to hear you both talk about what the contradictions are there in trying to make an enjoyable game that deals with these hard things, and how you both approach that sensitivity.
Yeah, it is quite challenging, and of course, the one thing of the whole, should games, or how do you do this when games are supposed to be fun, but then a game's But then again, games aren't really supposed to be just fun anymore. They can also be engaging. So there's a lot of different things that are entertaining. You know, if you sit and watch a movie that makes you cry, that's still entertainment. So it's the same thing for games. It's just we need to embrace that more, I guess. But yes, you still have to approach these things from a very sensitive, like, yeah, you have to be very sensitive because yeah, the topics are just too difficult. I mean, what we did initially there was also just trying to make sure that we can really, really, if not 100% understand what people went through, at least try as hard as we can by interviewing the people, talking to them. As we were doing things in the game, we would also show it to the Lebensborn children and to ask, like, is this okay? Does this feel representative? Of course, they're 67 years old now, so the whole idea of games to them seemed like a bit strange, but we managed to try and or in the end also actually get their approval for some of the stuff that we did. And I think just trying to use your emotional intelligence for these type of things. When we were making the game, we didn't know exactly where we were going to go with it. We knew we wanted to make a microcosm where you have a child that you take care of, and we wanted this child to be alive. The child has so many emotions that go on inside them that you can't see, but they're there and they're affected by you and how you respond to things. But there were also certain things that we decided to do that seemed kind of crazy at the time. Like, for instance, in the game, there's a lot of stuff that happens to the child. We have the stories of these people, of what they experience, so we wanted to bring that in. But when we were working with it, we also realized that we didn't want to show any of those scenes because it didn't seem right. And I'm really glad we didn't. So anything that happens to the child happens off screen because, well, number one, showing it, like some of these things is just too wrong to even to show, and you might end up getting hardened people in a way so that they distance themselves and then not wanting to see it. But at the same time, it didn't make sense from a motivational standpoint of the player, because if you're the parent and you see what happens to the child, you should be allowed to stop it. So one of the biggest things in the game is that all the stuff that happens off screen, and all you get to see is the aftermath. And you have to deal with the aftermath like a parent would.
So that sort of conveys that feeling of sort of powerlessness almost, and I guess maybe even a sense of potentially of doubt in the child, you know, of wondering whether this stuff really did happen and whether you can kind of do something about it.
Yeah, and a lot of the time it makes the player, especially that we don't show the emotions of the character, there's no stats showing that, makes the player a lot more attentive to the child. They come home and look okay, but maybe in the way that they speak, or the fact that they didn't want to hear a good night story that night, shows you that there's something wrong and you don't know what's wrong, and you can't, you know, you have to kind of go for a little while before you can figure out what's wrong. And that, I think that makes the player, according to also people who've been playing it, they start to be really paranoid and really attentive to everything that was going on with the child. And I think putting people in that situation makes them start caring about the topic as well. So when you get difficult themes, like now, like with the ISIS children, and whether or not those are worth projecting, you know, if you have a Norwegian woman going over, it's a difficult topic, but at the same time, if you've at least cared for someone that shouldn't, according to society, have been cared for, then maybe, you know, you stop thinking about the overarching theme, you just start thinking about the, you know, the humanity in it, I guess.
Yeah, just, you know, at the end of the day, they're all humans, and whether or not you care about all humans, I guess. I mean, Thierry, you approach that, and you approach this in a very different way, and you know, as you said, all of the difficult topics you cover are pretty much entirely optional, right? It's dialogue and talking to the shopkeeper, I think, and sort of, you know, it's the player's choice to engage in that or to have you know, the pure game experience of the game itself. You talk a little bit about why you chose to do it that way around.
Well, there's two reasons. One is I had never done anything as a writer before Messenger, or even as a game designer. I was just well, not just, but I was a gameplay programmer before. So I was also testing the waters in terms of writing. Would it be interesting, you know, also writing in a second language and all these things. But the more I thought of the experience, I thought I didn't want. It would have been a really hard sell to be like, hey, this game contains, you know, philosophy and or like actionable, you know, ways to start rethinking your life, or you know, and also it would perhaps turn away some of the people that might be interested in it if they only dare to take a look. You know, I think if the game has, well, not necessarily shock value, but if it's saying upfront, you know, oh, it will make you cry, or it will make you think, or it will be hard, or whatever, then there's a specific crowd for that, you know, and there's a personality types that will simply move away from it, you know, and but ironically, they're probably the people that are also the furthest from their emotions, and therefore perhaps the ones who would gain the most by connecting. So I'm thinking of Messenger more as a first step in those things, you know. It's like you can just dip a toe in it, you know, and the whole context was so light around it that you just went to look for yourself, and if you find something there and you're inspired to go further, then there are much more appropriate bodies of work that can help you through that. But certainly from the response we're getting, you know, people who weren't expecting, you know, it's like, hey, I'm 42 and I cried for the first time since I was 8 years old, you know. So we get a lot of that, and that means a lot, because that's someone who would stay away from something that sort of advertised that it would connect your emotions, because they're trying to avoid them, you know. And so it's not necessarily that it caught them off guard, because they did in the end go and look for themselves, because it's a very slow ramp up in the game, and it's tracking whether or not you care and you go for it, you know. And the more you go for it, the more it ramps up, you know. And at the very end of the game, then you kind of get the finale of that, you know. And so it's a good first step. It's kind of, I don't want to say necessarily an awakening, but certainly hearing from people who are like, look, I think I'm ready to undertake this now, because I had an sort of like an easy way in, you know. And then that opens them to a whole other catalog of types of games or types of books or perspectives, you know. So
Yeah.
you know, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really, there's obviously a hugely ingrained tendency, particularly in Western society, for men to be so distanced from their emotions, particularly men, I think. And you know, the idea of trying to normalize discussing that and normalizing therapy for men is very much an uphill battle, and sometimes you do really have
Right.
to almost kind of sneak it in there, right? And
Mm-hmm.
kind of take
Yep.
people by surprise with it as well. I think that brings us to an interesting point about you know, a slightly more prosaic point about some of the marketing and the practical aspects of some of this, of you know, what difficulties are you faced with when you make a game about a difficult subject? You know, is it a strength to be marketed about, and or is it something that, you know, you have to be a little bit cautious about? And also the kind of responses I think you've had from players. And I think you should have some interesting perspectives on this, having approached this so differently. But Catharina, obviously the core subject of the game was really everything in the message with the marketing and how you talked about it previously. Did you find there was much of a pushback, or were there any difficulties that arose from trying to sell people a game that was right off the bat going to be a difficult emotional experience for them?
Well, I felt like that depending on the type of market we reached. I mean, we don't have a huge budget for these type of things, but at the same time, we did notice that, you know, when The Guardian wrote about the game, they wrote about the game as in, "Ooh, this is difficult, this is going to be a hard game." Some other countries, we did really well in Asia for some reason, and I think it's also because it just looks so cute and wholesome and nice in the beginning. And just in the marketing, of course, in the marketing, we do say that, hey, take care of this child. Um, look, they're sad, take care of them. But I don't think they really realized how far we would go with it. And yeah, besides a few people who've misunderstood because of this does have a Nazi aspect, according to them. Besides those people, we haven't really had much pushback whatsoever. I was so ready to, okay, come on, bring the hate. But people have been really amazing, really. And the few people who have kind of been thinking like, oh, you're the one pushback that we did, or two pushbacks we've gotten. One was someone believing that we were being Nazi sympathizers. But then, of course, going into the dialogue with them, going, well, that's the problem. This is a child. This child has no political views whatsoever. And we managed to actually kind of convince them. And then the second pushback was on some people who felt that they should have been warned more about the more serious topics that we go into. We do warn that that this game is difficult and it can be triggering, but we didn't go into details because we don't want to let people know what's coming. I guess it's a little bit, feels a little bit wrong to say it, but yeah, it just kind of would have not been right. So, but yeah, in general, people have been extremely supportive.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting topic there, and I want to come back to that later about the idea of foreshadowing or even just overt trigger warning or content warning on difficult things, because there's obviously a real kind of artistic conflict there. But I'll come back to that a little bit later. I mean, Thierry, you were saying you got quite a lot of positive feedback from people who'd come across this stuff and done this sort of self-exploration, and people who had found that it had been really affecting them. Did you find that did you get much negative feedback as well, or did you find that actually people really genuinely saw this as a strength of the game?
On that aspect of the game, we didn't really get any. No, we only hear from people who are compelled to write to us, because they are thankful for the connection that they felt. But I think for sure, like for us, it being really just presented as, it's sort of like just a game, I think we would have had pushback if these bits were forced, if you had to sit through cutscenes of like, hey, here's a few things that can happen as you develop, and if you don't master, fear and shame and sadness and joy, and then you can be all dysfunctional, and then everyone can push your buttons and all that, and people will be like, hey, I don't care, I just want to kill demons, So I think it would have been some pushback there, because we don't really have those numbers, obviously, but I assume a huge part of our player base doesn't care at all and never really talk to the shopkeeper other than to buy an upgrade and get back to their adventure, and that's fine. That was part of the idea, was that it would be optional, just as it is in life, right? You're free to go about your way and never care about this, But so yeah, we were fortunate there of not really any negative feedback, but I bet there would have been if we had forced it and hadn't told them up front, I think that's the other thing is it wasn't sort of advertised at all that all of that is in there. So it's just a discovery that you get to make as you play the game. Since it's optional, it's like you just leave it there if you don't care,
Yeah, it's bizarre, isn't it? I mean, I think you're absolutely right there. That kind of feedback is so prevalent, particularly amongst the game's audience of which is such an odd reaction to that, of saying like, here's a genuinely helpful thing, a tool, a method of self-discovery or introspection that's entirely optional, but people can find that quite well, they make it sound like they find it quite offensive. They find it quite invasive to do that. That it's a hassle to talk about that stuff. And I think that in itself is a reflection of the kind of emotional repression that we're taught, and that people are so used to. But yeah, I think I was glad to see you didn't really get that sort of response from stuff. And I think it's weird that it is quite unique to games, and I think you raised an interesting point earlier, Catharina, when you were talking about other media, and I can't imagine there being a panel with this title if we worked in film or in literature, you know, because there aren't difficult things to talk about there. You know, films are sad all of the time. You know, there are films which exist only to make you sad and have that kind of cathartic process. There are films about extremely difficult topics that have been incredibly successful. You know, literature deals with this stuff all of the time, but games tend not to. Games tend to focus on, you know, either pure enjoyment or, you know, relatively throwaway things. And even as we've developed more and more attachment to complex narratives in which difficult things happen to people, they are often kind of backdrop to the gameplay and the mechanics themselves. And I think that's a shame. But I think things are changing. I would hear a little bit about what you thought about that, why you think that's happened, and what we can do as an industry to embrace that more, if you believe that we should.
Well, I feel that a lot of the games that I grew up with actually did teach me quite a lot and did bring in a lot of emotional elements. So I feel the games have been doing this for decades. But of course, yeah, we're doing it even more now. And I think the people growing up with those games, like Final Fantasies and Zeldas and a lot of other games that kind of did this, but in a more sneaky way. I think we get inspired by that and we want to do more, and we realize that, I think for me at least, that sure, that working with an important topic is very good. And at one point, it can even be a good marketing aspect. But I think also the biggest part for me is that creatively, it is so helpful. I really feel that from these topics and from just generally going through emotions and trying to understand how emotions can be connected to gameplay and how your gameplay can awaken emotions to other people, it's just really inspiring as artists as well, I think. So I think it's really good that it's happening. I hope that it, and probably never will become this kind of snobbery where it feels like all games have to do this all the time. But I think it's very positive, and that our industry is growing, and it also brings more people into gaming, because you have a lot of people. I've been doing talks for so many moms who are like, yeah, I don't want my kid playing games, and then I talk about the games that we do and other games that inspired me, and they start going, okay, maybe I should let him play, and maybe I should try myself. So I think it's a really positive development.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You know, things have been gradually introduced, and I think you're right. You know, as the medium's kind of matured a little bit, and as you say, people who have got an idea of how emotionally effective games can be have actually started making them and pushing that a little bit further. We're starting to see more and more of that. I mean, do you think that's a fair comment, Thierry? Do you think we're moving in the right direction for that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if we compare, I feel work like Catharina's been doing, it's like getting the more empathetic types who don't play games, getting them to play games, and then from the other side, it's like, you know, more hardcore gamer types, getting them to develop some empathy or connection or emotional connection, you know, and then so hopefully it can sort of like blend a bit more, and then everyone's on more on the same page and more connected, you know. And I think games are absolutely powerful to do that. And I agree, like I relate to having had, you know, takeaways and all of that, for it to not be seen as just a time sink, you know, or something you don't want your child to be doing. I mean, spending, you know, learning to love spending time in front of a screen solving problems is, I think, about the best thing you can do if you hope your child will end up with a stable job, a high-paying job. You know, it leads to working in tech. You learn to love being in front of a screen, figuring things out. You know, but also the idea that the game isn't just pure escapism that has no takeaways for your life. You know, I think that can also help make the argument for games that if through games you can learn morals or see models or start thinking for yourself or find some connection in ways that are powerful because they're all put together with sound and images. You know, no, there's definitely something to be said about that.
I meant to say at the beginning, actually, we'll have time at the end for some questions. So if there are any of the audience members who want to ask anything, I think you should be able to just type directly into the chat, and I will keep an eye on that and can ask any questions towards the end. We'll leave sort of 10 to 15 minutes there in case anyone wants to ask anything. I want to ask a little bit about the sort of the pacing of difficult subjects in games, and you know, trying to deal with player fatigue, and again sort of dealing with this dichotomy or perceived dichotomy of games as an entertainment product versus, you know, asking your players to do something which might be difficult, or at least hard work for them in a way that they're not expecting. I mean, do these things need to be broken up because so they don't become relentless? Do you have to intersperse them with other light-hearted topics?
Well, when we're doing my Child Lebensborn, we definitely had to have, you know, good and bad, good and bad. And I guess it's the same as with, you know, if the game is just constantly difficult, at least I'll rage quit because I can't handle that. I need it to also get easier at points. And but for us, it just fitted so perfectly with the whole topic of being a parent. At times the game can actually at times be quite boring, actually. You just go through days feeding the child, taking care of the child, mending the clothes, you know, the helping with schoolwork, and then something happens, or there's something nice that you want to save up money for, or something good that they're looking forward to, and it's really good to be breaking up these really difficult times with kind of reminders of why you're doing this. And also, I think even when we're trying to test this with like 12-year-olds and the topic is really heavy, and they were saying that, you know, because we were saying, well, it's going to get even heavier, and this is what's going to happen. And they were saying that, well, as long as we can help, then that's good. And I guess in our case, we're balancing between happy moments and really sad and frustrating moments. And we're also balancing between feeling helpless and also feeling like you can at least do something. So yeah, that balance is really important, to be able to balance between that. Although it's difficult because, I mean, I also played this war of mine, and that was just constantly a downer. But it was still, you couldn't put it down. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting example, because yeah, that is, you know, the just even the background noise, the kind of general mise en scène of the game, you know, it is that constant awareness of awful things. You know, there's constantly kind of gunfire and screaming and stuff in the background, and very little happens that's purely good, right? There's almost always a negative side effect. You know, if you get a new survivor turns up at your shelter, then it's usually because they're being chased by armed people or whatever.
I guess in that sense that they do this. One thing that we also do in the game, because towards the end it does get quite relentless, and you're like, is never good ever going to happen? What we do, that I also noticed that this war of mine does, is that it lowers the bar for what you see as positive. If you finally caught a rat in your cage and you can eat that, you're like, yes, this is the best day ever. And it's the same with the child. Like, the child comes home going, oh yeah, my teacher let me run away 15 minutes early so I didn't have to get caught and beaten up by the bullies. And you're like, oh, that's great, honey. You know, and you kind of realize, like, wait, that bar has been set, you know, lowered quite a lot since the beginning of the game.
Yeah. It's one of the things about it, this war of mine, and talking to the 11-bit guys in my old life as a journalist, and they were, you know, all living that experience. They were some of them were in or around Sarajevo or some of the other places in the war in the early 90s that were worst affected, and they said that they gathered a lot of the stories and some of the events from fellow survivors and people who had been through the war, and they gathered a lot of material that they just couldn't include because it was just too horrific, you know, just stories that were just so dehumanizing or so emotionally eviscerating that they thought, this is just, even in a game specifically about the horrors and the sadness of war, we can't really include this because it's too much. I'd be interested to know where your boundaries kind of lie in that regard. Whether you think as game designers, as artists making this kind of art, whether you have a responsibility to stop short or at a certain point, particularly with the events that you were sort of portraying, Catharina and Thierry, when you're talking about introspection and kind of self-awareness and emotional connection. What responsibilities you had as somebody who presumably isn't, a trained therapist, and bearing in mind individual experience of stuff, because it's a difficult thing to impose limits upon. But I think it's pretty clear that in both approaches there have to be points where you would either stop short of saying something or say that this is something you might need to talk to somebody who is professionally qualified about.
I guess Thierry can start since I've been talking a lot.
Sure. Well, the main thing for me was there's just a lot of disclaimers around it, but there's no, in the case of messengers, there's no shock at all. It's more like just chatting, and throwing things out like, oh, do you relate to this or that, and maybe this could mean this or that, or I found for myself that this or that happens, And the shopkeeper is always, hey, but I'm just a shopkeeper, but here's a fairy tale that got me thinking, and then they start talking about the moral, but it's always presented as like, here's my take on it or how I view it. But if you have another view, that's fine, So I don't think that's something, at least in the case of Messenger, I don't think it's something there's really a risk there, But certainly it's explained, not to take these things for granted, or that it doesn't come from a real place of authority on human psychology, Even though I did delve enough in that now that I feel that's perhaps something I would be doing with my life if games weren't a career to be had, But no, I think, so for me it was mostly about a message of hope, It was like how you can take that first step, and then if anything that's mentioned here doesn't connect or resonate for you, then that's valid. Don't start second guessing that maybe you're wrong because you disagree with the NPC in the shop, So it was really more about setting people on a journey that they then do themselves, and try to develop that confidence that whatever comes of that is valid as long as it truly comes from them. So I'd say I was pretty safe from that kind of risk there, but so maybe I'm on easy mode there, doing the beginner thing with my game,
Well, at least you're bringing people into the whole topic. I mean, for us, ours is, if you're not ready for that type of stuff, you might not come back. I don't know. Like for us, it was a topic we had to bring up. How shocking will it be? But then, since our goal was to tell the stories of these people, we decided we couldn't hold back anything. Luckily, since we did find this way of telling the story where you don't see things necessarily, it made it a lot more, well, not easy, but it made it possible. I don't think it would have been possible if we had to show the scenes of what the child experiences. But of course, we had a few scenes we had to cut because we realized that if we put this in and this and then this scene next to each other, it would almost seem slightly ridiculous, even though it was there. But we just felt like, no, that there's something here. We can't keep bombarding all these different, because it felt like we would make people back off in a way that it almost seemed like, no way, this didn't happen. So we try to be a little bit careful with that, but our game does tackle the topic of child molestation. So that's a choice we had to make pretty early on. And even though it was only towards the very, very end when we finally got to talk to enough specialists about this that we were confident enough to put it in. But it's, for us, since we were specifically telling the stories of these people, it was important that we didn't hold back, even though, it got pretty gruesome.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's about as dark as it gets, right? That's kind of right. far end of the spectrum, and that's something that has to be dealt with really carefully. It ties into there's a question from the audience actually about research, and obviously, Catharina, a lot of this I presume was sourced from the interviews you were having, and Dominic's asked how much research went into both the games that you created, and how much groundwork do you think has to be done before creating a game like this?
How much is quite difficult to say, but for this topic, we did quite a lot reading, because we felt we needed to learn everything, or not everything, but to learn quite enough about the Lebensborn children and what they individually went through, what the government did, what it was like just growing up in Norway after the Second World War. So, of course, having real sources is really helpful. I think all in all, we must have spent a couple of months just focusing on that. But when it comes into some more difficult topics like this, we couldn't talk directly to them because that again goes too far. Talking to them about, oh well, how did it feel, and so. But there's so many resources. Just even reading articles about how children express themselves when they're going through something like that, and signs for parents to look for. Just doing that type of research. I think any type of research is valuable, but making sure maybe that you actually have someone that you feel has lived experience, so that you can check and make sure that you're not crossing the boundary, because it's impossible to just assume you know what they're going through. And if we had made this assumption about what happens towards the end of the game with your child, we would have made something that was horrible. It would have not done justice at all. Because I talked to someone who had written a book about the experience and was teaching kindergartners about this, then it actually made me at least understand enough to be able to do something that I felt was responsible at the end. Don't know if that's just pattering around the answer, but yeah.
That sense. And Thierry, I think you sort of mentioned that a lot of this was, this was kind of you doing a lot of soul searching and introspection here, and I imagine that was quite a cathartic experience doing that. Did you do other research? Did you talk to other people about their experiences, or is there more of a kind of purity in talking about it from a single perspective in this sort of thing, because no two experiences are alike with the sort of stuff that you were writing about?
Yeah, well, it's hard to pinpoint, because it all started with a mental breakdown some 12 years ago, and then this quest to kind of climb out of that, what I called being stuck in the well, basically climbing out of the well, was just a very long journey, and so dozens of books and heaps of therapy, and then making new friends that are more healthy, and removing dysfunctional people. And so basically it was all these takeaways, all these lessons, all these things I tried to distill, essentially everything I learned through that, and to deliver it in a way that's fun and entertaining, so that people can sort of get these pointers, so that hopefully it doesn't take them 12 years. It's to make that first contact, make you realize, oh, here's a description of an issue or a state your life can be in that perhaps you relate to. And so then more of the stories and the things that happen in the game you can relate to, and then you can get these pointers if you care to take that journey. So yeah, it's hard to, in the end for me, it was like, here's a breakdown of the points I'd like to get across, of the things I wish I knew and I think are worth sharing, or at least other people knowing, or to be passed on, if that makes sense. And then here are all the metaphors of things I want to redeem or beat up or just show the world, to help me grow and heal and journal, essentially, to put some things behind me, and also this act of being really vulnerable and showing everyone what you do, and opening this window, so that your feelings might be mocked, if that's going to be what happens. Sure. There's a risk to be taken there, and there's also something to be said about that, I think. So yeah, I don't know about necessarily research, but certainly internal research has been plenty.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that self-reflection is absolutely research. There's this kind of idea that innately we know ourselves and know everything about ourselves, but I think that's a complete fallacy. As someone who's spent several hours in therapy myself, you realize
Yeah.
very quickly that you are constantly discovering stuff. It's not
Mm-hmm.
just telling someone something you already knew. The whole process of therapy is about
Right.
that discovery and things.
If I
And
can add one little thing there, I think if you want to make a game, as you mentioned, if you want to make a game about something, it does help to go into your own experiences. Like, I think it would probably have been impossible for us to make my Child Lebensborn and for me to write that if I didn't feel I could connect with the child on at least some of the easier topics of bullying, being beaten up in school, having a parent that doesn't have enough money to take care of you, kind of putting your own personal experiences into something. I think at least if you can do that, then you should feel confident that you can make something. Of course, the second you want to bring in someone else's stories, then it's really important to make sure that you have the research. But yeah, if you're making something that's like Thierry's doing, that's based solely on your own experiences, then that should be enough, I feel.
Yeah, I think there's some interesting discussion about the responsibility you have when dealing with something out of your immediate experience, as you say there. Whether it's white people talking about race, or whether it's men talking about feminism, or just dealing with something that's completely outside of your own experience. There's a real risk of doing more harm than good if you've not properly researched that and you're not doing it in the right sort of sensitive way. We've got a couple more questions from audience members as well. Benjamin has asked that in the journey of developing your games, were there things that you learned how to be sure that your players, to make sure that your players are not just consumers of the story that you're trying to tell them, but to make sure they are participating? So essentially, I think probably what it's saying there is, to make sure that this isn't just a passive witnessing of the story, but to try and encourage a learning and an engagement, I suppose.
I guess for us that was was kind of surprised when we started looking into the nurture genre, because choosing that type of genre already set a lot of the groundwork for us in making sure that the player is an active participant, because they have this thing, this human, this pet that they're supposed to build up and care for. So I think already in that genre, you are actually saying that, yeah, okay, this is yours, this is valuable to you, take care of it. And for us, of course, as well, we did have giving the player choices. So we had 3 different parenting styles, with usually getting 3 different choices of what you want to tell your child. And I think in that sense, it was quite easy for us already to do that.
Yeah. And Thierry, obviously, you took a very different approach to that, really, and almost the opposite approach of making it completely optional for the player to do that. I mean, we talked a little bit earlier about the sort of responses you were getting. Do you know what sort of percentage of people actually fully participated in those conversations? Do you have statistics on how many people saw all of those dialogue options? Or
We don't have like the telemetry in the game, for that. We don't have the raw data of the player experience, but we hear about this a lot more. Like the people who come to us, join our Discord and want to discuss the game. Really often it's because they want to talk more about how they felt, and they want to relate, and it's kind of lit, this beacon of look, we care about these things genuinely, and so our online space became a place where people show up and they want to be vulnerable and have conversations with each other, but our Discord, as it's a very small fraction of how many people actually got the game, so I don't really have any figures on that, but for sure I think the fact that everything is optional and is something that you go and get yourself, it doesn't feel like a lecture. It's more that since you're interested and you go get it yourself, it's more empowering in this way. And it's actually by the end of the game, you have yourself done proactively a few steps, you know, towards this journey, because you didn't have to go for it. It's not something you had to sit through. And it's kind of in the same way that, you know, the book that you're forced to read, you know, when you're 12 years old, you probably think it's a boring novel, you know, but then the first one that you pick up for yourself because you feel it's compelling, then perhaps you have that first experience of, it can be really cool to read because it was your own choice, and so you had like ownership in there, and it's something you did yourself and for yourself instead of just an answer to authority, you know. So yeah, having all of that optional was always the vision in my case.
Mm-hmm. And I think that reflects the process of therapy again, really, right? You know, nobody sits down with the first episode of a therapist and they say, well, you've got X, Y, and Z, or this is the emotional problem you're addressing, because that doesn't teach you anything. If you just have someone else tell you that and go, yeah, here's why you're sad all the time, or here's why you're never sad, you know, that doesn't help
right.
at all.
Right. Well, so having been told who you are so much all the time is probably why part of why there's issues in the first place. So it's the last thing you want from someone trying to pull you out of that, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. There's one more question from the audience which is about Hellblade. It's obviously quite a high-profile game that dealt with a lot of difficult topics. You know, Ninja Theory have done this a few times now, and they make games which are commercially and critically successful, which deal with some really tough stuff. Have either of you played the game, and how did you feel about the way that they dealt with, particularly you know, mental health in that?
I mean, for me, other than it's fabulous, it's you know, just hearing the question, I think I kind of have that itch now. I think I need to replay it this week. No, it's a great one, and it's actually a great source of inspiration, and also in how they, like, there's a good case to be made there of why you would need a death or like, quote, game over mechanic in your game. It's like this one feels like you can't single out even one gameplay system or game loop that doesn't kick into the story and the emotion and everything that they're trying to convey or make you connect with. So yes, absolute masterpiece for anyone who hasn't played it and who's interested in what we're talking about right now.
Sadly, I've only been able to play the beginning, so I don't feel like I can say too much. From what I've seen, though, it does seem like it does a lot of good things. And I've also heard, I've been in talks where the developers were there, and you actually had some people, one woman in the audience who actually just had to say that her mother suffers from a few of the things that actually the character in Hellblade suffers from, and that playing that game had actually made it possible for her to understand what the mom was going through, and their relationship had gotten a lot better because of that game. So
wow,
yeah,
I think that's really great.
Yeah, potentially quite a lot of power there. It's astonishing that, you know, considering how many games we've all played that have, you know, a bit set in a mental institution, or, you know, a character who's supposed to be crazy or has certain issues, and so few of them deal with that at anything other than an extremely superficial level. You know, there's still this taboo and fear around kind of delving into that, and this idea that it's somehow not quite sacrosanct, but just not worth discussing. I think that's such a sad thing, but it's a difficult thing to portray in an active media where you're asking people to participate, right? Particularly and I think Hellblade does this in a really interesting way, in that, you know, you are this character, you have agency, you have control, but then it is taken from you at points. You are subjected to the same experiences that cinema has, and you experience the dysfunctional reality, to put it in a not particularly apposite way, but, you know, these experiences that she has are kind of imposed upon you in a way, so you really have no way to shy away from it. I think it's a really brave and interesting way to deal with it, and I think it's quite effective. Okay. Well, thank you very much. That was really interesting. I think maybe just one other thing I did want to ask just before we finish. We have about 5 minutes left. So if there are any other questions from the audience, do put them in now, so we have a chance before the end. But one thing we did touch on earlier, which I want to come back to, was the idea of content warnings and trigger warnings. I think this is something you mentioned briefly, Catharina. And I think that's that's a really tricky one, because I absolutely believe in content warnings and trigger warnings on pretty much all content. I think it's, having known and been very close to some people who have had some really traumatic experiences, who find that, suddenly being confronted with certain things is an extraordinarily difficult and affecting thing. I think it's a very valid thing for people to want, but it was also obviously a bit of a compromise on an artistic basis, because you are very clearly foreshadowing something that you might want to be a shock. You can lose some impact from it. You can put people off it. It's, it doesn't flow naturally into a storytelling medium. So I just wanted to hear a little bit about what you both thought about that idea.
Well, for me, it wasn't necessarily that we wanted to create a shock, but I feel like, for a content warning, we were completely fine with setting up a content warning that there are disturbing things here. There are things that could trigger you, amongst other things, and then talking about the more known stuff. But when it comes to the child abuse, I mean, it's I was just so worried that would end up being something you would constantly start looking for, and that it somehow would, you would start with that in your mind, seeing that first. Then you see the kid and you just kind of go, you know what? No, I'm not ready for this. I cannot deal with this, that this is going to happen. And I think, so that's why we decided to, of course, set up a trigger warning so people know it's going to get tough, but to go into that much specifics, it just felt like it would, So it's a difficult part, because it's not necessarily about shocking people but at the same time, it just, for instance, if someone gives me a spoiler to anything, I will constantly look out for that. And anything that I see or hear in a movie or a book, it will just kind of ruin the whole experience of what I'm trying to go through. So
great. And Thierry, it might not be such a pressing issue, I guess, in the way you presented things, but is there any point where you thought, we might need to have a little bit more of a buffer before we go into this next story? This thing might be a particularly difficult thing for somebody to read about.
It's not so much, in my case, trigger warnings weren't really necessary, because there's absolutely zero shock in there. There's nothing, graphic or even descriptive. It's really more about just the emotion. And then it always goes into hope and how to try and start affecting that change. And it's always just from one lived experience perspective, and it's presented as that, but so it was more about, look, I'll create this safe playground for the two of us, to have a discussion, and what I'll do is I'll be vulnerable first, so then you don't have to fear my judgment or whatever, because what I showed you is I took a bigger step than I'm inviting you to take if you're comfortable taking, so I always have a bigger risk than you in this kind of conversation, if that makes sense. But also there's always, it won't just dive into that right away. You start talking to the shopkeeper, and the first thing you get is kind of like, hey, you might want to stop touching that, because otherwise I'll start ranting about this and that, and then you keep going, and it's like, because you've been stubborn and did it like 25 times, and it's like, all right, sit down and let's have a chat. And again, it's only words, there's no audio or animation or even evocated, like Catharina was mentioning, things happening off screen, and you can I bet infer a lot, and I understand that can be difficult. So I know for me, I'd appreciate the trigger warning there, of knowing what I would get into, but also, I guess it's a tough question, because you don't want to spoil it either, because you have a build-up, because you want to bring into conscience some of these issues that you're working on. And so if you spoil it before you properly onboard it in your experience, then I bet that's a tough question, but that's another one I get to dodge, I guess.
Well, maybe not for your next game, who knows?
Yeah, maybe not. We'll see.
Well, thank you both.
I just wanted to mention one thing,
Sure.
and it's not about necessarily advertising, but I have a stream, or I have it recorded, and then with Q&A talk tomorrow at 1:30, and I think also, like, I'll in that, I also go in and kind of show like specifically what type of research we've been doing for a lot of things. So if that people are curious about that, and also how you're working with some of the gameplay connected to the stuff that's going on in the game, then people could also check that out at 1:30 tomorrow.
Cool.
All right. Well, I think we can keep the discussion going on in the Discord after session voice chat and text channel. So do join us there if you have any other questions to ask. But yeah, thank you both for your time. Really appreciate it. That was super interesting, and yeah, I think you're both doing really valuable work. So thank you both for that as well.
Thank you.
So much.
Cool. Thank you, and
Have a good
thank
day.
you everyone for listening. Cheers.
Bye.